I want you to picture something for me. You wake up on a Tuesday morning. You make your coffee the same way you have for 40 years. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, standing at the kitchen window watching the birds on the back fence. You are in your own home. You are in your own life. Nothing feels wrong. And then your son knocks on the door. He says he's taking you on a drive. He says you've seemed tired lately. He says he's been worried. You don't argue because he's your son and you trust him. You've always trusted him. So you grab your jacket, you leave your coffee half finished on the counter, and you get in the car. That was the last morning I spent as a free man for longer than I want to admit. My name is Harlan. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years as an architect. I designed buildings that are still standing in 4 states. I raised a son. I loved a wife. I buried that wife, and then, without ever seeing it coming, I was handed over like a problem that needed storing somewhere quiet. My son's name is Marcus. He's 44. He has his mother's eyes, and as I would later discover, absolutely none of her conscience. The drive that morning took about 40 minutes. I noticed early on that Marcus wasn't taking the route toward the town. I asked where we were going. He said, "Just a place I want to show you." I watched the road signs. We were heading out toward the eastern county line, toward the older part of the suburbs where the lots are bigger and the buildings are more spread out. I asked again. He turned up the radio slightly. Not enough to be rude, just enough to make the conversation harder. I should have pushed. I didn't. We pulled into a long driveway lined with oak trees. The building at the end was large, beige, well-maintained. There was a sign near the entrance, Maplewood Care Center. I read it twice. I looked at Marcus. He was already out of the car, pulling a bag from the back seat. A bag I hadn't packed. A bag I hadn't known existed until that moment. "Marcus," I said, "what is this?" He told me it was temporary. He told me the house needed some work done. Pipes, he said, maybe the foundation, and that it wasn't safe for me to be there during repairs. He told me this place was very comfortable, very well reviewed, that I'd have my own room. He talked fast and he didn't look at me while he talked. He carried the bag to the entrance and held the door open and waited for me to walk through it. And God help me, I walked through it. I don't know what I was thinking in that moment. Maybe I was still processing. Maybe some part of me didn't believe it was real. You don't expect betrayal to announce itself. You don't get a warning. One moment you're drinking coffee in your own kitchen, and the next moment someone who calls you dad is handing a stranger a folder with your name on it. The woman at the front desk was professional and kind. She called me Mr. Mercer. She gave me a wristband. A wristband. Like I was checking into a hospital or a theme park or something in between. Marcus signed several forms. He answered questions on my behalf, even when the questions were clearly directed at me. At some point I stopped listening and started looking around the lobby. It was quiet, in the way that places are quiet when they're trying very hard not to feel sad. There were flowers on a side table. There was a painting of a lighthouse on the wall. There was soft music coming from somewhere, the kind of music that has no edges, no beginning, no end. And then she walked past. She was moving quickly, a clipboard in one hand, and she was clearly in the middle of something. Talking to a staff member, nodding, glancing at a paper. But as she passed the front desk, she looked up. She looked at me. And she stopped. Not for long. Maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, something passed across her face that I have thought about every single day since. It wasn't surprise exactly. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. The kind of look you give someone when you see them somewhere they should not be. The look of someone who already knows the end of a story that you haven't been told yet. She was maybe 50, dark hair pulled back, wearing a white coat with a name badge I couldn't read from where I was standing. She looked at me. Then she looked at Marcus. Just briefly. Just for half a second. And then she turned and walked away down the corridor and disappeared. Marcus hadn't noticed her at all. He hugged me at the door. He told me he'd visit soon. He told me not to worry. Then he got in his car and he drove away, and I stood there in that lobby with my wristband and my borrowed bag and absolutely no idea what had just happened to my life. But here's the thing that stayed with me more than the room, more than the wristband, more than any of it. That woman had looked at me like she knew me, and I had never seen her before in my life. Who was she? And why did she look at me like she already knew exactly what was happening, and exactly who had made it happen? Stay with me, because this is only the beginning. Before I tell you what happened inside that place, I need to tell you who I was before I got there. Because none of what comes later makes sense unless you understand the life I had built, the life I believed in, the life I thought was solid, the way you believe a wall is solid until someone shows you the rot hiding inside it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. Nothing remarkable about my childhood. Working-class family, 2 parents who stayed together, a dog named Buster who lived to be 14. I was the kind of kid who drew buildings in the margins of his notebooks. Floor plans, elevations, cross-sections of imaginary skyscrapers. My teachers thought I was daydreaming. I was actually planning. I put myself through college, got my architecture license at 26, spent the next 4 decades doing work I was genuinely proud of. Schools, libraries, a regional hospital, a handful of private residences that still make me smile when I drive past them. I was never famous. I was never wealthy in the way people mean when they say wealthy. But I was comfortable. I had a pension. I had investments. I had a house that was paid off and a savings account that could carry me through my remaining years without depending on anyone. That last part matters. Remember that. I met Carol when I was 31. She was working at a city planning office, and we kept ending up in the same permit approval meetings, arguing opposite sides of the same zoning debates. She was sharp. She was funny in a dry, quiet way that snuck up on you. She had this habit of tilting her head slightly when she thought you were wrong. Just slightly, like a bird reconsidering a branch. I fell in love with that head tilt before I fell in love with anything else. We married 2 years later. We had Marcus when Carol was 34. He was a good kid. I want to be fair about that. He was a genuinely good kid for a long time. Curious, thoughtful, made us proud in the ways parents want to be proud. Carol adored him. I coached his baseball teams. We took family road trips every summer until he was old enough to find road trips embarrassing. When Marcus was in his late 20s, he started a small property management company. It struggled at first, and I helped him. Not extravagantly, but meaningfully. A loan here, a co-signature there. Father things. Things you do without keeping score because you don't imagine you'll ever need to. Then Carol got sick. It was a Tuesday when she got the diagnosis. Funny how Tuesdays keep showing up in this story. Pancreatic cancer. Late stage. The doctors were kind, but they were also honest. And what they were honestly telling us was that we had months, not years. We had 9 months, as it turned out. 9 months that were both the longest and the shortest of my life. During that time, Marcus was attentive. He visited often. He helped around the house. He sat with his mother on the hard days. I was grateful. I told him so. I told Carol he had turned into a good man, and she smiled and said yes, and I believed we were all in agreement about that. Carol died on a Thursday morning in April, 3 years ago, quietly at home, the way she had wanted. What I didn't know, what I could not have imagined, was that something had already begun changing in Marcus long before she passed. Something I would only understand much later, when the pieces finally arranged themselves into a picture I couldn't look away from. 6 months after Carol died, Marcus introduced me to his new business partner, a man named Derek Sloan. Derek was polished in the way that sets your teeth slightly on edge. Good suit, firm handshake, always smiling a half-second longer than the moment required. He called me sir in a way that felt more like a strategy than a courtesy. I shook his hand and smiled back and told Marcus afterward that I thought Derek seemed like a sharp businessman. What I actually meant was that something about Derek felt rehearsed. But I let it go. Marcus was enthusiastic. The business seemed to be growing. I didn't want to be the suspicious old man who couldn't let his son stand on his own. 18 months ago, Marcus sat down with me at my kitchen table and explained that it would be practical. His word, practical, for me to grant him power of attorney, just for financial matters. Just so that if anything ever happened to me suddenly, he could handle things without delays or complications. He had paperwork ready. He had already consulted a lawyer. He was thorough and calm, and he made it sound like the obvious thing that any responsible family would do. I signed it. I signed it because he was my son, and I was 66 years old, and I had just lost my wife, and being practical sounded like exactly the right thing to be. After that, the visits changed slightly. He started asking questions, not intrusive questions, just questions. About the investment accounts, about whether I had updated my will since Carol passed, about the deed on the house and whether I had considered downsizing. Each question on its own was reasonable. A son looking out for his aging father. Nothing alarming. Nothing you could point to and say, there. That's where it started. But I want to ask you something. Have you ever ignored a gut feeling about someone close to you? Pushed it down because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider? I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments, honestly. Because I did exactly that, more times than I can count, over those 18 months. And each time I pushed that feeling down, Marcus and Derek got one step further ahead of me. I just didn't know it yet. The life I described to you, the savings, the house, the accounts, the power of attorney, all of it was now in my son's hands. And I was sitting in a nursing home with a wristband on my wrist and no phone and no documents, and a woman in a white coat who had looked at me like she was watching a clock run out. In the next section, I'm going to tell you what I found out about that place. And it was not what Marcus had told me. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being in a place where everyone is professionally kind to you. Not genuinely kind, professionally kind. There's a difference, and you feel it immediately. In the way they smile just slightly too quickly, in the way they answer your questions without actually addressing them, in the way the warmth in their voice never quite reaches their eyes. Maplewood Care Center was full of that kind of kindness, wall to wall with it. And within 24 hours of arriving, I understood that the kindness was not there to comfort me. It was there to manage me. My room was on the 2nd floor. It was clean, adequately sized, with a window that looked out over a small courtyard garden. There was a single bed, a dresser, a television mounted on the wall, and a small desk with a chair. It looked like a photograph of a room rather than an actual room. Everything in its place, nothing personal, nothing that said anyone had ever actually lived there. I unpacked the bag Marcus had brought. Someone had packed it for me. Clearly not Marcus himself, because the selections were odd. 3 shirts, but only 1 pair of trousers. No belt. No reading glasses, which I need for anything smaller than a billboard. No phone charger. And most importantly, no documents. No wallet beyond a small amount of cash. No identification beyond what Maplewood already had on file. I asked the floor nurse about my phone the first morning. She told me it had been logged with the front desk for safekeeping during my settling in period. I asked what settling in period meant and for how long it lasted. She smiled that professional smile and said it varied by resident and that I should speak with the care coordinator. The care coordinator was unavailable that day. She was unavailable the next day, too. On the third day, Marcus visited. He brought flowers, yellow ones, cheerful, the kind of flowers you bring when you want to signal that everything is fine without actually discussing whether everything is fine. He sat in the chair by my window, and we talked about nothing for 20 minutes. The weather, a baseball game, whether the food was acceptable. I waited until he was relaxed, and then I asked him directly, "Marcus, when am I going home?" He shifted in the chair, just slightly. "Dad, let's just focus on getting you settled first." "I am settled. I've been here 3 days. When am I going home?" He said the house repairs were taking longer than expected. He said the contractor had found additional issues. He mentioned something about the electrical system. Each explanation arrived smoothly, one after another, like he'd rehearsed them in the car on the way over. I asked for the contractor's name. He said he'd have to check. I asked to see the repair estimate. He said he'd bring it next visit. He never brought it. I then asked about my investment accounts. A simple question. Just whether the automatic transfers Carol and I had set up were still running properly. Marcus's expression did something subtle in that moment. A small tightening around the eyes. A fraction of a pause before he smiled. He said everything was fine and changed the subject to whether I needed more clothes brought from the house. After he left, I sat at my window for a long time and watched the courtyard garden and thought about that pause. That evening, I met Patrice. She was one of the overnight floor nurses, a heavy-set woman in her late 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct, unhurried manner that told you immediately she had been doing this work for a very long time. She came in to check on me around 8:30 and noticed I hadn't touched my dinner tray. She didn't make a fuss about it. She just set it aside and asked if I wanted tea instead. I said yes. She came back with tea and sat on the edge of the chair, not intrusively, just present, and asked how I was actually doing. Nobody at Maplewood had asked me that yet, how I was actually doing. I told her the truth. I told her I didn't fully understand why I was here, and that my son wasn't giving me clear answers, and that I was beginning to feel less like a patient and more like something that had been filed away. Patrice listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. Then she looked up and said very calmly, "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Has anyone given you any documents to sign since you arrived?" I said no. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something rather than resolved it. She stood up, smoothed her uniform, and picked up the dinner tray. And then she paused at the door and turned back and said, quietly, evenly, in a tone that carried the specific gravity of someone who has chosen their words very deliberately, "If anyone brings you papers to sign, any papers at all, for any reason, don't sign them. Not until you've had someone outside this building look at them." Then she left. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. I want you to think about what she said. A nurse, a woman with a job, with a livelihood that depended on the goodwill of this facility, had just told a resident not to trust what was coming. She hadn't elaborated. She hadn't explained. But she had taken a risk to say that much, and we both knew it. What documents were coming? Who was sending them? And how did Patrice know they were coming at all? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in that clean, impersonal room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the note, about Marcus's pause, about the woman in the white coat who had looked at me like she was watching something terrible unfold in slow motion. And the next morning, she came back. She knocked on my door at 7:15 in the morning. I was already awake, had been awake since 5, which had become my pattern in that place. There is something about institutional silence that pulls you out of sleep early. Not a loud silence, a managed one. The kind that reminds you, even before you open your eyes, that you are not in your own home. She opened the door and stepped inside, and I recognized her immediately. The white coat, the dark hair pulled back, the clipboard, the same woman from the lobby on my first day. The one who had stopped and stared and then disappeared before I could speak to her. She was composed now, professional. She introduced herself in the tone of someone who performs introductions dozens of times a day. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Voss. I'm the consulting physician here at Maplewood. I'll be conducting your initial health assessment this morning. Just routine, nothing to be concerned about." She set her clipboard on the desk and began the standard preliminary checks. Blood pressure, pulse, a small light in each eye. She asked about my sleep, my appetite, whether I experienced dizziness or confusion. The questions were clinical, and I answered them flatly because I was still watching her, watching the way she moved, the way she positioned herself, whether she would give anything away. She gave nothing away. Until she made her mistake. It happened midway through the assessment. She was writing on her clipboard and she said, without looking up, "Have you experienced any significant stress recently, Mr. Harlan Voss?" She stopped writing. I stopped breathing. The room was very quiet for about 3 full seconds. Then she looked up and something crossed her face. A shadow, quick and controlled, like a door being pulled shut before you can see what's inside the room. "Mercer," she said smoothly. "Mr. Harlan Mercer. Forgive me. I was looking at 2 files simultaneously this morning." It was a good recovery, fast and plausible. If I had been less alert, less awake, less unsettled by everything that had already happened, I might have accepted it. But I had been awake since 5 in the morning, with nothing to do but think. And I had just heard her say a name that was not mine. Voss. She called me Mr. Harlan Voss. Her name was Dr. Voss. I let it go in the moment. I nodded as if I had accepted her correction, and I answered the rest of her questions, and I watched her finish the assessment with the same composed efficiency she had carried in with her. She made a note. She told me my blood pressure was slightly elevated. Understandable, given the adjustment period, she said, and she moved toward the door. "Dr. Voss," I said. She turned. "How did you know my first name before I introduced myself?" She smiled, practiced but not unkind. "It's on your intake file, Mr. Mercer. We review all resident files before initial assessments." "Of course," I said. She left. I sat on the edge of my bed and turned the name over in my mind, like a stone I'd found in an unexpected place. Voss. My late wife's name had been Carol Mercer. Carol Mercer for 32 years, since the day we married. But her name before that, her maiden name, the name she had carried through her childhood and her 20s and into our first meeting in that city planning office, was Voss. Carol Voss. That was who she had been before she became mine. Now I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know that Voss is not an uncommon name. I know that coincidences exist and that I was sleep-deprived and emotionally raw and living in circumstances designed to make a person feel disoriented. I considered all of that. I genuinely did. But here is the thing about a detail that doesn't fit. It doesn't leave you alone. It sits in the corner of your mind, and it taps. Quietly, persistently, patiently. It taps until you look at it properly. Dr. Voss came back 2 more times that week under the guise of follow-up assessments. Each time she was professional, and each time she lingered slightly past the clinical necessity of the visit. She asked questions that felt personal without being obviously so. She asked where I had grown up. She asked about my career. She asked, almost casually, whether Carol and I had met through work. On her 3rd visit, I asked her directly, "Did you know my wife?" She was quiet for just a moment too long. "What makes you ask that?" "Because you move like someone who already knows answers to the questions you're asking me." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the door. Checking, I realized, whether it was fully closed. She looked back at me, and something shifted in her expression. The professional composure didn't disappear exactly, but something underneath it became briefly visible, something careful and tired and sad. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should talk properly. Not here and not now, but soon." "To tell me one thing first," I said. "Just one." She waited. "Is your first name Elena?" The question clearly surprised her. Her chin lifted slightly, eyes sharpening. "How do you know that?" "I don't," I said. Carol used to say that name sometimes. When she was very tired near the end, she'd say it quietly like she was thinking out loud. I always assumed it was a memory. Someone from before my time. Dr. Elena Voss stood in my doorway for a moment that felt much longer than it was. And then she said, very quietly, "She talked about you every time we spoke, right up until she couldn't anymore." She left before I could respond. I sat completely still in that room and felt the world rearrange itself slightly around me. Carol had known this woman, had spoken to her, had kept her entirely separate from our life together, from me, from Marcus, from everything. A person named Elena Voss, who shared Carol's maiden name, and who was now standing inside the same facility my son had just placed me in. That was not a coincidence. That was something Carol had arranged. But why? What had Carol known that she hadn't told me? And what had she been afraid of? The answers were closer than I realized. And they were going to arrive in a form I never could have anticipated. In an envelope with my name on it. Hidden in a place no one was supposed to look. There is a small library at Maplewood. I use the word library generously. It is really just a converted sitting room on the ground floor. 2 walls of donated paperbacks, a pair of armchairs, a round table with a jigsaw puzzle perpetually half-finished on it, and in the corner, almost apologetically, a single desktop computer. A sign above it read, "Resident Internet Access, 15 minutes per session." I had been eyeing that computer since my 2nd day, but the library was rarely empty during daytime hours, and I hadn't wanted an audience for what I needed to do. I wasn't entirely sure what I needed to do. I just knew I needed access to something outside these walls, some thread I could pull that connected back to my real life. Patrice made it possible. She found me in the corridor on a Wednesday morning and told me without preamble that the library would be empty between 6:15 and 6:45 that evening. The overlap between the end of the afternoon activity session and the beginning of the dinner service, when staff were occupied on the dining floor and residents were returning to their rooms to wash up. She told me I had the computer to myself for 30 minutes if I wanted it. I want you to understand what Patrice was risking. She was a nurse at a care facility doing a quiet favor for a resident she had known less than 2 weeks. If anyone had asked her about it, she could have explained it away. But she had still chosen to tell me, chosen to create that window, chosen to help me. People like Patrice restore something in you when the world has just finished taking something away. I was in that library at 6:16. I sat down at the computer, and I thought carefully about where to begin. I decided to start with myself, with my own name, with my own house. I searched the property records database for my county, and I typed in my address. The result came back in under 10 seconds. My house, the house Carol and I had bought together 28 years ago, the house I had paid off in full 11 years ago, the house where I had left a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter the morning Marcus drove me here, was listed as collateral against a commercial loan. The loan had been filed 8 months ago. The borrower on record was a business entity. Sloan Mercer Property Solutions, LLC. Sloan, as in Derek Sloan, Marcus's business partner. The polished man with the rehearsed handshake and the smile that lasted a half-second too long. Mercer, as in my name. Used without my knowledge to register a company I had never heard of. I sat back from the screen and made myself breathe slowly. I had 15 minutes of search time remaining, and I could not afford to waste them sitting in shock. I searched the business registration for Sloan Mercer Property Solutions. It had been formed 14 months ago, 4 months before Marcus had sat at my kitchen table and asked me to sign the power of attorney. Formed by 2 registered agents, Derek Allen Sloan and Marcus James Mercer. I searched my own name alongside the words legal notice. 3 results came back, all from the past 6 months. 2 were routine public record filings I didn't fully understand. The third was a notice of pending competency evaluation, filed in the county probate court. A competency evaluation. Someone had already filed paperwork to have me legally declared mentally incompetent. Before I had ever arrived at Maplewood. Before I had ever been given the chance to demonstrate that there was nothing wrong with my mind. I had 4 minutes left on the session timer when Patrice appeared in the library doorway. I thought she was there to warn me that time was almost up. But she was holding something, a manila envelope. She set it on the table beside the keyboard and spoke quietly. I found this behind the bottom shelf on the far wall about a week ago. It was pushed back flat against the baseboard, easy to miss unless you were down on your knees cleaning, which is what I was doing. I almost threw it out. Then I saw the name on the front. I looked at the envelope. My name was written on it, in handwriting I recognized before I had fully processed the recognition, the way you sometimes know a smell before you can name it. The letters were careful and slightly slanted, the capital H looping in a particular way. Carol's handwriting. I looked up at Patrice. "I haven't opened it," she said. "It's not mine to open." She left me alone with it. I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something genuinely, because I think about this question more than almost anything else from that night. If you found a letter written by someone you loved, someone you had lost, someone who had been gone for 3 years, would you open it? Right then, alone in a strange place with no one to sit with you while you read it? I'd really like to know. Tell me in the comments, honestly. Because I sat there for almost 2 full minutes before I could make. There were 3 letters inside, each one folded separately, each one dated. The dates were wrong. That was the first thing I noticed, and I noticed it immediately, and I sat with it for a long moment before I allowed myself to understand what it meant. The first letter was dated 4 months after Carol died. The second, 6 months after. The third, 8 months after. Carol had been gone for 3 years. These letters were dated within the last 2 years, which meant one of 2 things. Either someone had forged Carol's handwriting with extraordinary precision, or something about what I believed to be true about Carol's death was not the complete picture. I began to read. By the time I finished the 3rd letter, my hands were not entirely steady. The letters were written as instructions, formal in tone, specific in detail. They referenced my investment accounts by name. They referenced the house deed. They referenced a physician, unnamed, who would provide documentation confirming cognitive decline. They referenced Maplewood Care Center specifically, by name. And at the bottom of the third letter, in that familiar slanted handwriting, was a single line that made everything inside me go cold and quiet. In the event of Harlan's incapacitation, full estate authority transfers immediately and irrevocably to Marcus James Mercer. Someone had built the legal framework to take everything from me, and they had built it using the handwriting of my dead wife. In the next section, I'm going to tell you who did it, and what they couldn't have known was already working against them. I didn't sleep that night either. I lay in that room with the envelope on the desk beside me, and I stared at the ceiling, and I did what I had spent 38 years as an architect training myself to do. I looked at the structure, not the emotion of it, not the grief, or the fury, or the disbelief, but the actual bones of what had been built around me. The load-bearing walls, the foundations, the points where the whole thing could collapse. Because that is what this was, a structure, carefully designed, methodically constructed, built by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Let me walk you through what I had pieced together by the time the sun came up. 14 months ago, before the power of attorney, before Maplewood, before any of it, Marcus and Derek had quietly registered a company using my surname without my knowledge. They had then spent the following months positioning that company to absorb my assets, my house as collateral on a business loan, my investment accounts presumably next. The power of attorney I had signed gave Marcus the legal authority to move all of it without requiring my signature on individual transactions. The forged letters, written in Carol's hand, dated after her death, created a secondary legal instrument. If the power of attorney was ever challenged, the letters would serve as supplementary documentation of Carol's final wishes regarding my care and estate. A dead woman's handwriting is very difficult to argue against in a probate court, especially when the man arguing against it has already been flagged for a competency evaluation. It was elegant in the way that ugly things sometimes are. Every piece covered another piece. Every document closed a door that might otherwise have let me out. I was still sitting with all of this when Elena Voss knocked on my door at 7:30. She came in, and she did not pretend this was a medical visit. She sat in the chair by the window, and she looked at me, and she saw the envelope on the desk and the expression on my face, and she said simply, "You found the letters." "You knew about them," I said. "I knew they existed. I didn't know where they were. I've been looking for them since I arrived here." I asked her to tell me everything. She was quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when they are deciding how much truth a person can hold at one time. Then she seemed to decide that I had already earned the full weight of it. Elena Voss was Carol's younger half-sister. They shared a father, a man who had kept two separate families in two separate cities for nearly a decade before both families found out simultaneously and everything collapsed. Carol was 16 when she discovered Elena existed. Elena was 9. The fallout was severe and lasting, and Carol had spent most of her adult life keeping that chapter of her history in a separate compartment, away from me, away from Marcus, away from everything she had built. But she had never lost Elena entirely. They had maintained quiet contact over the decades, careful, irregular, always private. Carol had never told me because she had never found the right moment, and then the moments kept passing, and eventually the secret had simply become part of the architecture of who she was. 6 months before Carol died, she had contacted Elena directly. Elena told me this part slowly, and I listened without interrupting. Carol had found discrepancies. Small ones at first. An account statement that didn't match her records. A transfer she didn't recognize. A document in Marcus's handwriting that referenced assets she hadn't known he was aware of. She had been sick and exhausted and in pain, and she had not had the strength to confront Marcus directly. But she had been sharp enough. Carol was always sharp enough to understand what she was looking at. She had contacted Elena because Elena was a physician she trusted completely, because Elena had no connection to Marcus's or to Depashmagic, and because Carol needed someone outside the situation to be holding certain information in case she was no longer around to protect it herself. She had asked Elena to do one thing specifically. Watch over Harlan. If anything goes wrong, watch over him. Elena had agreed. She had quietly positioned herself to join Maplewood's consulting rotation 8 months ago, knowing, based on what Carol had told her, that Maplewood was likely to appear in whatever plan Marcus was building. She hadn't known the exact timing. She hadn't known the exact mechanism. But she had been here, waiting, watching the resident intake lists for the better part of a year. When she saw my name on the intake form the afternoon I arrived, she had walked to the front desk immediately. The moment in the lobby, the 3 seconds where she had stopped and stared, had not been surprise. It had been confirmation. The thing Carol had feared was actually happening. I sat with all of this for a long moment. Then I asked the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since I first read those dates on the letters. Elena, the letters are dated after Carol died. Someone forged them. But the detail inside them, the specific account names, the property information, the reference to Maplewood, that level of detail doesn't come from nowhere. Either Marcus had access to Carol's private papers or... I stopped. Elena looked at her hands. Or, I said. Carol did write letters, Elena said carefully. Real ones. To me, toward the end. In those letters, she documented everything she had found. The account discrepancies, her suspicions about Marcus, her fears about what might happen to you. She wrote them as evidence, essentially. A record in case she wasn't believed later. So someone got access to those original letters, I said, studied her handwriting, learned the financial details she had documented, and then used all of that to create forgeries that said the opposite of what Carol actually intended. Elena nodded. The elegance of it turned my stomach. Carol had tried to protect me by creating a paper trail of the truth. And someone had taken that paper trail and reversed it, rewritten it, turned her own careful documentation into the instrument of my destruction. I asked Elena if she had any proof, anything that could be taken outside these walls and used. She looked at me steadily. Carol gave me things to hold. Documents, records, copies of the original account statements with the discrepancies circled. I've been adding to it since I arrived here. Things I've observed. Things Patrice has passed along. And there's something else. She reached into the inner pocket of her white coat and produced a small USB drive. She set it on the desk beside Carol's envelope. Carol mailed this to me 3 weeks before she died. She said if I ever had to use it, I would know when. I think we both know when. I looked at that small piece of plastic sitting next to my dead wife's forged handwriting, and I felt something shift inside me, away from grief and shock and towards something harder and quieter and considerably more focused. What's on it? I asked. Elena's expression was careful and sad and certain all at once. Enough, she said. If we can get it to the right people, enough. I didn't know yet what enough actually meant. I didn't know what was on that drive. But I was about to end out. and what it contained would not just expose Marcus and Derek. It would reopen the question of how Carol actually died. Elena didn't open the USB drive in my room. She told me it wasn't safe, that Maplewood had a staff computer network and she had reason to believe certain activity was being monitored. She had a personal laptop locked in her car and she would access it there, alone after her shift. She would come back in the morning with what we needed to know. I spent that entire day in a state of suspended tension that I can only describe as standing very still on ice you are not certain will hold. I ate my meals. I nodded at staff. I sat in the courtyard garden for an hour in the afternoon and watched two sparrows argue over a bread crust, and I thought about Carol. I thought about the last months of her life, the way the illness had moved through her, fast and then faster, accelerating past every timeline the doctors had initially offered. I had accepted that acceleration as the nature of her particular cancer. Pancreatic, aggressive, unpredictable. The oncologist had prepared us for the possibility that the progression would outpace the prognosis, and it had. And I had grieved that fact without questioning it, because grief does not interrogate. Grief simply absorbs. But now certain memories were rearranging themselves. The physician who had been most present in Carol's final weeks had not been her primary oncologist. He had been a palliative care consultant brought in by Marcus. Marcus had found him. Marcus had recommended him. Marcus had handled the insurance coordination so that Carol and I wouldn't have to deal with paperwork during an already devastating time. I had been grateful. I had thanked my son for handling it. His name was Dr. Philip Okafor. I remembered him clearly. Quiet, methodical, always slightly distant in a way I had attributed to professional boundaries. He had adjusted Carol's medication protocol twice in her final 3 weeks, both times explaining the adjustments in technical language that neither Carol nor I fully understood, both times reassuring us that the changes were standard comfort care procedure. I was thinking about Dr. Okafor when Elena knocked on my door the next morning. She came in and sat down, and she set her laptop on the desk, and she opened it, and she turned it toward Ma without saying anything first. The USB drive contained 4 categories of files. The first was a folder of scanned financial documents, original account statements from our joint investment portfolio going back 3 years, with Carol's handwritten annotations in the margins. She had circled unauthorized withdrawals, small ones at first, 2,000 here, 5,000 there, beginning almost 2 years before she died. She had tracked them methodically, noted the dates, cross-referenced them against Marcus's visits. The total across all accounts across the full period came to just under $400,000. $400,000 moved out of our accounts before Carol was even gone, before the power of attorney, before Maplewood. Marcus had begun draining us long before he had legal authority to do so, which meant he had found another way in. A password obtained without permission, an account access Carol hadn't known he had. The second folder contained emails, printed and scanned, forwarded to Elena by Carol from a private email address Marcus didn't know existed. The emails were between Marcus and Derek Sloan, a thread spanning 14 months. They discussed the estate in the language of a business transaction. They discussed the power of attorney as a milestone. They discussed Maplewood specifically as the necessary precondition for, and I am going to quote this directly because the language matters, full and uncontested asset liquidation. That phrase, full and uncontested asset liquidation, that is how my son referred to my life's work. My home, Carol's jewelry, the retirement accounts we had spent 30 years building together. Asset liquidation. The third folder stopped me completely. It was a single document. A medical board disciplinary filing dated 14 months ago. The subject of the filing was Dr. Philip Okafor, Carol's palliative care consultant, the physician Marcus had found and recommended and managed. Dr. Okafor had been struck from the medical registry. The reason listed was falsification of patient records and improper medication administration across multiple cases. The filing referenced an investigation conducted by the State Medical Board involving 3 separate patients. All 3 had been elderly. All 3 had been in the final stages of terminal illness. All 3 had experienced accelerated decline following Dr. Okafor's involvement in their care. I read that paragraph 3 times. Elena was watching me. She didn't rush me. She let me sit inside what I was reading for as long as I needed. All 3 patients had experienced accelerated decline. Carol's progression had accelerated past every timeline her oncologist had projected. Marcus had introduced Dr. Okafor. Marcus had managed the entire relationship. Marcus had handled the paperwork so that I wouldn't have to worry. I looked up at Elena. Was Carol one of his cases? My voice was level. I was surprised by how level it was. Elena's jaw tightened slightly. Her name isn't in the disciplinary filing specifically. The medical board investigation was limited in scope. They only pursued cases where surviving family had filed complaints. Nobody filed a complaint about Carol because nobody knew to file one. She paused. But Carol suspected. That's why she documented everything. That's why she sent me the drive. She knew he was doing something to her. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't certain what. She was a woman in the final stage of cancer, being told that her decline was simply the nature of her disease. It is very hard to argue with that when you are the one dying. Elena's voice was steady, but something behind her eyes was not. She told me in our last conversation that she was frightened, not of dying, of what was going to happen to you after she was gone. I closed the laptop. I needed a moment and I took it. I looked out the window at the courtyard garden, and I breathed, and I let the full shape of it settle over me. Marcus had been stealing from us for years. He had arranged my institutionalization with legal precision. He had forged Carol's handwriting to create documents that would strip me of everything. He had partnered with a man named Derek Sloan to liquidate my entire life within 60 days of my placement here. And he had introduced a disgraced physician into Carol's final weeks of life. I turned back to Elena. "The 4th folder," I said. "You haven't shown me the 4th folder." She reached over and opened it. It contained a single audio file. She pressed play. The recording was a phone call. The audio quality was slightly compressed, but the voices were clear. I recognized the first voice immediately. Marcus. The second voice I had only heard a handful of times, but it was distinctive enough. Smooth, slightly clipped. Derek. Marcus said, "Once the old man is placed, we liquidate everything within 60 days. The house goes first. Buyer is already lined up. The accounts follow. By the time anyone thinks to ask questions, there won't be anything left to find." Derek said. "And if he makes noise?" Marcus said, "He's already been flagged for competency evaluation. Anything he says gets filtered through that. Nobody listens to a confused old man." The recording ended. I sat in complete silence. "I want to ask you something. And I mean this genuinely, wherever you are watching this tonight. I want you to imagine hearing your own son's voice say those words about you. I want you to sit with that for just one moment. Because I had to. I had the evidence. Elena had the drive. But what happened next told me that someone already knew we had it. And they were moving faster than we were. Elena did not come in for her shift the next morning. I knew her schedule by then. She arrived at 7:15, same as the morning she had first knocked on my door. I was awake at 6 as usual, and I watched the courtyard from my window and I counted the minutes, and at 7:30 I accepted that she wasn't coming. I went to the nurse's station and asked casually whether Dr. Voss was in the building. The staff nurse, a young woman named Brianna, who was pleasant and entirely unaware of anything happening beneath the surface of this place, checked her screen and told me that Dr. Voss had called in sick that morning. She smiled apologetically and said another physician would be covering any medical needs today. I thanked her and walked back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. Elena had not mentioned feeling unwell the previous morning. She had been composed, alert, entirely herself when she left my room. She had taken the laptop with her. She had taken the USB drive. She had told me she would return today and we would discuss next steps. People who are planning next steps do not call in sick the following morning. I was still sitting with this when Patrice appeared in my doorway during her rounds. She came in and pulled the door nearly closed behind her. Not fully, just enough to reduce the radius of the conversation, and she spoke quietly and quickly. 2 men had come to the facility the previous evening, not during visiting hours, after visiting hours, which officially ended at 8. They had spoken to the facility director in his office for approximately 40 minutes. Patrice had not seen them arrive but had seen them leave. She described them carefully. One heavy-set, one lean, both in dark clothing, neither wearing anything that identified them professionally. They had not signed the visitor log. Visitors who don't sign the visitor log are not visitors. I asked Patrice if she had seen either man before. She said no. I asked if she had any idea what they had discussed with the director. She said the director had been noticeably quiet for the remainder of the evening and had left without his usual end-of-day walkthrough of the floor. I asked whether anyone had gone to Elena's office or her locker after hours. Patrice said she hadn't seen it directly, but that the corridor outside the consulting physician's room had been accessed using an administrative keycard at 9:47. She had noticed it on the access log panel near the nursing station, which she checked routinely as part of her evening security protocol. 9:47. More than an hour after Elena's shift would have ended. Someone had accessed her workspace after she was gone. I thanked Patrice and she left, and I stood at my window and looked out at the courtyard and thought carefully. The most important question was not where Elena was. Elena was a grown woman with resources and judgment, and she had been preparing for this situation longer than I had. If she had disappeared, it was because she had chosen to, because something had told her that staying visible was no longer safe. The most important question was whether she had gotten the contents of that drive to anyone before she disappeared. I didn't have a way to contact her. I didn't have my phone. I didn't have access to anything outside these walls except a 15-minute library computer session that now felt dangerously exposed. Marcus arrived at 11. He did not bring flowers this time. He came into my room with the particular energy of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it. Purposeful, slightly accelerated, wearing a smile that was doing a great deal of work to cover what was underneath it. He was carrying a leather document folder. He set it on the desk without preamble, and he opened it, and he turned it toward me. It was a competency waiver. Multiple pages, dense with legal language, formatted with the kind of professional precision that signals a real attorney had been involved. There were several tabbed sections marked with adhesive arrows indicating signature lines. Marcus explained it quickly and smoothly. He said it was simply a formality, a document that would allow him to continue managing my affairs without the administrative friction of ongoing approval processes. He said my care coordinator had recommended it. He said it would actually give me more peace of mind because everything would be handled without me needing to worry about it. He produced a pen from his jacket pocket and held it out. I looked at the pen. I looked at the document. I looked at my son. I thought about Patrice's warning on my third night. I thought about Carol's letters. I thought about the audio recording and Marcus's voice saying, "Nobody listens to a confused old man." I looked up slowly and said I needed my reading glasses before I could sign anything. Marcus said he hadn't seen my reading glasses in my bag when he packed it. I said that was strange because I had been using them all week and asked if he could check at the front desk in case they had been logged there. He hesitated, just briefly, then agreed and left the room. I went immediately to the window. Derek Sloan's car was in the parking lot, a gray sedan, third row, engine running. Derek was visible in the driver's seat, looking at his phone, waiting. They had come together. Marcus inside with the document, Derek outside as, what? Support? An exit plan? I didn't know, but I understood the shape of it. This was not a casual visit. This was a scheduled operation, and I was the last moving piece that needed to be locked down. I had perhaps 4 minutes before Marcus returned. I sat back down on the edge of my bed, and I looked at that document, and I thought about Elena, wherever she was. And I thought about that USB drive, and I made a decision. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, I was not going to sign anything. And if Elena had done what I believed she was capable of doing, I might not have to face this alone much longer. Marcus came back with a smile and an excuse about the reading glasses. I told him I was tired and needed to rest before signing anything important. He left the document on the desk. He said he'd be back tomorrow. He didn't know that tomorrow was already too late for him. The next morning arrived the way significant mornings often do, quietly, ordinarily, with no outward indication that everything was about to change. I woke at 5:45. I washed my face and dressed carefully, the best of the 3 shirts Marcus had packed, the single pair of trousers, no belt. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the courtyard lighten gradually, from gray to pale gold, and I thought about Carol. Not about the investigation, or the documents, or the conspiracy. Just about her. The way she looked in morning light. The way she tilted her head when she thought you were wrong. I thought, she built this, all of it. She knew she was running out of time, and she used what she had left not to rest, but to protect me. She found Elena. She documented everything. She mailed that drive. She fought for me from inside a dying body, and I had never known it was happening. I was done being the man who didn't know things were happening. At 7:10, Patrice appeared in my doorway. She didn't say anything. She simply looked at me with an expression that said, "Today is the day," and gave a small nod and left. At 7:20, Marcus arrived. He was alone this time. No Derek in the parking lot. Or if Derek was there, I couldn't see him from my angle. Marcus came in with the document folder again. Same leather, same adhesive tabs, same pen produced from the same jacket pocket. He set everything on the desk with the efficient movements of someone completing a task they have already completed in their mind several times. "Dad," he said, "I need you to sign these today. The attorney has a filing deadline." I didn't look at the document. I looked at Marcus. I looked at him the way you look at someone when you are seeing them clearly for the first time. Not the version of them you constructed from love and hope and 30 years of choosing to believe the best, but the actual person standing in the actual room. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been managing a complicated project for too long and was ready for it to be finished. I said, "I know about Sloan Mercer Property Solutions." Marcus went very still. "I know about the loan against the house," I said. "I know about the competency evaluation that was filed before I ever arrived here. I know about the forged letters. I know about Dr. Okafor." I watched his face move through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, recalculation, a flash of something that might have been fear, and then a very deliberate resettling into a harder expression. The smile disappeared entirely. What replaced it was not the face of my son. It was the face of someone who had been doing business and had just encountered an unexpected complication. "You're confused," he said. His voice was even, almost gentle. "That's exactly what we've been concerned about, Dad. This kind of paranoid thinking, these accusations, this is precisely why you need proper care right now." "Don't," I said quietly. "I'm serious. The doctors here have documented—" "Marcus!" I said his name once, firmly, and something in my tone stopped him. "I heard your voice on a recording. I heard you tell Derek that once the old man is placed, you liquidate everything within 60 days. I heard you say that nobody listens to a confused old man." I paused. "So let's stop pretending." The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at the document folder, then at me, then at the door. I could see him calculating, running the numbers on how bad this was, what could be salvaged, whether I had actually heard what I said I had heard, or whether I was bluffing. I was not bluffing. "Whatever you think you know," he started. The door opened. Not Patrice. Not a staff nurse. Elena walked in. She was composed and unhurried, and she was not alone. Behind her came a man in a dark jacket with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where things had gone wrong. A detective, I would learn moments later, from the County Financial Crimes Unit. His name was Detective Arlo Chambers. Behind him came a woman I didn't recognize, sharp-eyed, carrying a briefcase, the kind of composed that comes from being a lawyer for a long time. Behind them, in the corridor, I could see two uniformed officers. Marcus turned from the door back to me. Something in his face broke open. Not remorse, not yet, but the specific expression of a person watching a plan they spent years building come apart in under 60 seconds. "Mr. Marcus Mercer," Detective Chambers said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of elder financial abuse, fraudulent use of power of attorney, and conspiracy to commit probate fraud. There are additional charges pending review of newly submitted evidence." He paused. "I'll also inform you that Derek Sloan was taken into custody approximately 40 minutes ago." Marcus said nothing. He looked at me one more time. A long look, complicated and unreadable. And then he looked away. They walked him out. I sat in that chair and listened to the sounds of it. Footsteps in the corridor, official voices, the specific silence that follows when a room empties of everything it had been holding. The lawyer, Elena's contact, a woman named Patricia Osei, who specialized in elder law, came back in and told me that a court order had been filed that morning, freezing all transactions related to my assets. The house sale that Marcus had been arranging had been halted. The accounts were locked pending investigation. Nothing had been finalized. Nothing was gone. I looked at Elena standing in the doorway. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it wherever you are tonight. I want to know, has anyone ever done something for you that they didn't have to do, that cost them something real, that you could never fully repay?" Leave it in the comments, because that is exactly what Elena Voss had done for me. A woman I had never met, honoring a promise made to a woman we had both loved. I stood up from the chair. I walked to the window. I looked out at the courtyard garden, the same courtyard I had stared at from a position of helplessness for weeks. And I breathed. Then I walked out of my room, down the corridor, past the nurse's station where Patrice was standing, and she looked at me and smiled, a real smile this time, nothing professional about it. And I walked through the front entrance of Maplewood Care Center and out into the open air. It was a cool morning. The sky was very blue. A bird was doing something enthusiastic in a nearby tree. I stood there, and I just breathed. They had Marcus. They had Derek. They had the evidence. But there was still one question that hadn't been answered. The most important one. The one about Carol. That answer was coming, and it would be the one that finally let me grieve her properly. The law moves slowly. I say that not as a complaint, but as an observation. As someone who spent the months following that morning, watching the machinery of justice turn at its own pace, grinding through evidence and depositions and court filings with the unhurried thoroughness of something that cannot be rushed without breaking. But it did move, and where it moved decisively. Marcus was formally charged 6 weeks after his arrest. The charges were substantial: elder financial abuse, fraudulent execution of power of attorney, conspiracy to commit probate fraud, and forgery of legal documents. The forged letters, once submitted to a forensic document examiner, were confirmed as fabrications. The paper stock was inconsistent with anything Carol had owned. The ink dating placed the letters within the past 2 years, and certain microscopic inconsistencies in the letter forms, tiny hesitations invisible to the naked eye, revealed the hand of someone copying rather than writing naturally. Someone had studied Carol's handwriting with great care and patience. The examiner said it was among the more sophisticated forgeries she had encountered. That assessment did not help Marcus's case. Derek Sloan cooperated with investigators relatively quickly, which surprised no one who had looked closely at Derek Sloan. When the choice was between loyalty to Marcus and a reduced sentence, Derek's loyalty evaporated with remarkable speed. His cooperation confirmed the financial timeline, confirmed the registration of Sloan Mercer Property Solutions using my name without consent, and confirmed the existence of a prearranged buyer for my house, a transaction scheduled to close within 50 days of my placement at Maplewood. 50 days. That was all the time I had left in my own life before it was sold out from under me. The house was returned to me fully. The frozen accounts were unlocked following the court order. The loan filed against my property using the forged power of attorney was voided. Patricia Osei, Elena's lawyer, who became briefly my lawyer, navigated all of it with the kind of efficient precision that made me grateful for competent people in ways I had not fully appreciated before. The unauthorized withdrawals Marcus had made before the power of attorney, the $400,000 Carol had tracked in her annotations, became a separate restitution matter. Recovery would be partial and slow. Some of it had already moved through the business accounts into places that would take time to trace. I accepted that. You reach a point where the return of money matters less than the return of yourself. Now I need to tell you about Carol. The question of Dr. Philip Okafor and what had happened in Carol's final weeks was the one that kept me awake the longest. It was the question that sat at the center of everything else like a stone at the bottom of clear water. Visible, undeniable, impossible to simply leave there. The state medical board's existing investigation into Okafor was expanded following the submission of Carol's documented records and Elena's testimony. A formal review of Carol's case was opened. Her medical records from those final weeks were subpoenaed and examined by an independent panel of oncologists. Their findings were careful and qualified, as such findings always are, built with the particular language of people who understand how much weight their words carry. They confirmed that certain medication adjustments made by Okafor in Carol's final 3 weeks were inconsistent with standard palliative care protocol. They confirmed that the rate of her decline accelerated beyond what her primary oncologist's projections would have anticipated, even accounting for variability. They could not confirm with medical certainty that the adjustments had caused her death. She had been terminally ill, her cancer was advanced, These facts remained true, but they referred the case to the district attorney's office for further investigation. That investigation is ongoing. I cannot tell you how it ends because I don't know yet. What I can tell you is that Okafor's medical license has been permanently revoked and that he is currently the subject of a criminal inquiry involving not just Carol's case but 2 of the 3 patients named in the original disciplinary filing. I hold on to that. On the harder nights, I hold on to that, and I think about Carol documenting those account discrepancies from her sickbed, circling numbers in the margins of statements with a pen she could barely hold, fighting for me with everything she had left. She deserves the truth to be fully known. I believe it will be. I returned to my house on a Thursday morning. Funny how Thursdays kept appearing. The mirror image of all those Tuesdays. Patricia Osei drove me. Elena sat in the back seat. We didn't talk much on the drive. Some arrivals don't need narration. The house was exactly as I had left it. The coffee cup was still on the kitchen counter. Someone had rinsed it, probably Marcus during one of his post-placement visits, but it was sitting in the same spot. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the back fence, and after a moment a bird landed on it. Not the same bird, but close enough. Elena stayed for 3 days. We sat at my kitchen table and she told me things about Carol I had never known. The hidden half-sister relationship, the complicated father, the decades of quiet, careful contact. She told me about their last phone call. She told me Carol had laughed during part of it, even then, even at the end. That sounded exactly right. We have stayed in contact since. She comes for a weekend twice a year. We are careful with each other in the way people are careful when they share something that costs them both a great deal. But we are also, I think, genuinely fond of each other. Carol would have found that satisfying. Marcus is awaiting trial. I have not spoken to him since the morning they walked him out of Maplewood. I don't know what I will say when the time comes, if the time comes. I think about it occasionally, the way you think about a door you are not ready to open. I have learned to leave it closed for now. What I want to leave you with, wherever you are watching this tonight, whatever brought you here, is something I have turned over many times in the months since all of this ended. I trusted my son completely. I signed documents without reading them carefully. I ignored feelings that were telling me something was wrong because ignoring them was more comfortable than the alternative. I handed over control of my life piece by piece to someone I loved, and I did not verify a single thing because verification felt like accusation, and I did not want to be that kind of father. Trust family, but always verify the truth. Not because the people you love are necessarily lying to you, but because love is not the same thing as knowledge. Because trust without attention is not trust. It is just hope wearing trust's clothing. And hope on its own is not sufficient protection against people who have decided to treat your life as a transaction. Carol knew this. She verified. She documented. She built a safety net from inside a dying body because she loved me enough to do the hard thing even when the hard thing was almost beyond her strength. That is what real protection looks like. I am 67 years old. I still make my coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. I still stand at the kitchen window in the morning and watch whatever bird happens to be on the back fence. I still live in the house Carol and I built our life inside. And every morning when I stand at that window, I think about the woman who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. And I make sure I am paying attention to everything around me, because now I know what it costs when you stop. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If it moved you, if any part of it felt true to something you've experienced or feared, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have someone in your life you've been meaning to check on, an older parent, a grandparent, someone living alone, maybe tonight is the night you make that call. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.